Hey, power people. Welcome to Renewable Rides, powered by VECKTA. I'm Gareth Evans, the CEO and founder.
And I'm Dan Roberts, head of sales. In each episode, we'll uncover the latest trends, learnings, challenges, and triumphs relating to the energy transition, on-site energy, and sustainability through the experiences of our inspiring guests and team here at VECKTA.
So get ready for an exhilarating adventure into the fast-paced world of challenging limits, adapting purposefully, and empowering co-creation to accelerate the energy transition with those that are on a mission to create a more resilient, profitable, sustainable, and thriving energy future. So let's go.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Renewable Rides. Super excited today to be joined by two of my colleagues. Today, actually, I'm solo from my co-host Gareth Evans, but joined by two great colleagues here for an exciting topic. So I am joined by Patrick Baker, Director of Business Development here at VECKTA, as well as Paul Ziessler, Energy Development Analyst. So Patrick, give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Patrick Baker, business development and helping folks find the VECKTA marketplace. And I'm very interested in this topic specifically because I'm in PG&E territory, which we're going to cover here in a moment.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself real quick. So like Dan said, I'm the lead energy development analyst at VECKTA, which just means I do most of the feasibility study work for any of the projects that we are looking at or helping a customer understand. I've assessed at this point probably over 100 projects in pretty much every energy market that exists in the US and beyond.
Excellent. Well, we've got two great people, and like I said, an exciting topic. On a recent episode, we talked about the breakdown of an energy bill, and we touched on energy charges and demand charges, and within that, there's a variety of other charges, and everybody will see their overall utility bills going up. But on today's topic, we're going to talk a bit about grid hardening and what is that. Talk through a specific example of that's really developing right in front of our eyes within PG&E territory in Northern California, and ultimately how it impacts you as business leaders, business owners, or as the utilities like to call us, ratepayers. So, Paul, can you give a little bit of background on grid hardening?
Yeah, I'd love to. So a good place to start with this, right, is really the age of the grid, right? So, and when we're talking about the grid, what I'm mainly focused on here are distribution lines, right? So we could talk about transmission. That's kind of another system that is managed more at the federal system, but I'm going to be focused on distribution, right? So when we're talking about the grid, you can think about PG&E, SCG&E, whoever is sending you your energy bill generally. So in most cases, in most places in the United States, right, the grid is over or right around 100 years old. So this is aging infrastructure. And you couple that with the fact that depending on where you are in the U.S., you're experiencing some pretty severe natural disasters, right? So some examples of this are back in, some years ago. I'm from New Jersey, right? So Sandy was a great example of this. There was a lot of grid hardening that happened in New Jersey after that. Right now, I think one of the topics that we're going to discuss is PG&E's grid hardening efforts. What Dan means when he says grid hardening, that can mean kind of a laundry list of things. Generally, it just means making the grid infrastructure itself more resilient or eliminating it altogether, right? So there's a couple shapes that this usually takes. The one that's somewhat traditional, I guess, or that makes intuitive sense is called grid underground, or it's just called undergrounding. So you're essentially taking the lines and burying them. It's a fairly costly endeavor. That's something that PG&E is currently tackling. There's a couple other ways that you can attack this as well, right? So the unorthodox one would just be to eliminate lines altogether where you can in rural enclaves and replace them with what we do, Dan, right? Distributed energy resources. If you can build your generation on site and you don't have to use the poles and wires anymore, you can get rid of the poles and wires. So that's, an example of grid hardening that the utilities might not be so interested in. But that's kind of what we're discussing here today. Yeah. And I'll leave it there for now, so I can blab on about this stuff.
Yeah, no, that's good background. So can you give us a little bit of the background on the specifics of what we're talking about here in PG&E territory and what they are proposing or what they're considering?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do that, there's actually an element here that I forgot to mention that I really should mention. So I don't know if you guys got the chance to talk about this in your last episode, Dan, about the way your utility charges you, but the actual mechanism in which the utility is allowed to make money is pretty important in this specific case that we're going to be talking about here today, right? PG&E. So the utilities have a number essentially that in the industry is referred to as rate base, which is essentially the value of their assets that they're allowed to take returns on, right? So this is what the customer at the end of the day pays for, right? So the maintenance and the development of these assets that actually get your electricity to you. And generally the way this works is the utility is allowed to take a certain percentage return on that rate base. And that's determined in their general rate case, which they work out and present to the state regulator. So a good way to think about this is, there's a pie. The utility is allowed to take 7% of that pie, for example. So the bigger that pie, the more money the utility makes. And one of the ways the utility can grow that pie is by spending money on, quote unquote, hardening the grid. So in PG&E's case, they're currently seeking approvals to underground 2,000 miles of distribution lines. And they're saying that that's going to cost them somewhere around $3 million a mile, right? So you can do the math on that. You end up in the billions of dollars pretty quickly, right? So they're expecting that's going to cost around $6 billion. And really, they have plans to do this for 10,000-ish miles worth of distribution line, right? So this is about a $30 billion plan when it's all said and done. And that's all done under this idea of, okay, we got to quote unquote harden the grid, right? In PG&E's case, I think Patrick can talk to this, right? He lives up there. They've had a lot of fires recently. And unfortunately, that's because the grid is, I guess you could call it a soft grid, but really it's just a poorly managed grid, in my opinion, right? If a line hits a tree and that tree goes up, that's expensive. That ends up being expensive for the ratepayer. The utility happens to be in a kind of win-win situation, right? Where they get to say, yeah, okay, well, to solve that problem, to eliminate that risk, we've got to spend a bunch of money and we got to recover that money somehow, right? So in the case of PG&E, you could make a callous argument that they're somewhat benefiting from their previous mistakes. They're going to get to grow their rate base essentially on these grid hardening efforts.
Yeah. And so certainly in regulated utility areas, this is exactly how these utilities grow over time. They increase the rate base, the pie gets bigger. That means their portion of the pie, especially if it's a set percentage of the pie. In this example, we're talking 7%. That is how they grow as a business and how they return value to shareholders. And this is all part of the large business. And it's important as ratepayers. And I always think it's interesting that we are referred to not as customers, but as ratepayers among these utilities. That this is how they grow. This is how they make money. This is how they again return value to shareholders. So there's a lot, and this can be a very emotional and charged topic, if you will, no pun intended there. But I'd love to maybe pass it over to you, Patrick, and hear a bit of your perspective, both as a resident in PG&E territory, but also as someone that's owned businesses there for many years, as very close friends and colleagues that own businesses that have been directly impacted by many of the wildfires. Talk to us a little bit about your perspective on the ground there.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate the introduction that Paul did as a good background in terms of how we got to where we're at currently and how PG&E makes their money, and I think that's the real that's one of the really important topics that needs a lot more discussion relative to how PG&E makes money. And their money comes directly from those rates that us users are charged, and having that as a topic relative to how the grid is being hardened and or fixed, if you will. We say hardened internally. It's an industry term necessarily, but essentially, in my view, it's fixing the grid. The grid is currently broken. And, wasn't intended to be broken, but it's made up of a whole bunch of pieces that are vulnerable over time if you don't maintain them. So it's almost a kind of a catch-22, and in that if PG&E is almost incited to not maintain them necessarily and have to do some type of revamp so that they can increase the base of costs that they receive a percentage of. So it's not intuitive, and no other capitalistic system necessarily works in this manner. But one of the points that I think Paul and I really enjoyed a conversation with before, and was the impetus for part of this conversation, was the fact that there's kind of two proposals being laid out by PG&E right now, and one of those is a less expensive option to cover the current lines, distribution lines in particular. What Paul made a distinction between distribution and transmission lines. So the distribution lines are the lines, the last mile to your house, so to speak, versus burying those lines, which is much more expensive, which PG is in favor of. And again, I think their incentive, to Paul's point, is because that gets them more, a percentage of a bigger piece of the pie. So they're spending more money to do that job. To state my case, as a PG&E ratepayer, I definitely do not want to be spending more on my energy bills. One of the proposed numbers was, if PG&E was allowed to do what it's intending, that could potentially raise ratepayers' prices by about $38 a month. That's a significant number, and so this is an important topic. I think, though, part of it is it's from my perspective, it's pay me now or pay me later, and a big part of my perspective is seeing the development of a system that isn't working, continually needs to be repaired, and putting a partial solution to fix a real problem that is integral to all of the business in the country. Not just, this isn't a California problem. This is a problem throughout the country in terms of energy powers our productivity in the United States. And so making an investment to do it right, I feel very strongly that underground systems are the right way to do it, and putting a partial solution with covering them while they're still suspended in the air is just another fodder for additional improvements to come in the future that will need to be repaired and generate more money for PG&E and less and more money out of the pockets of PG&E ratepayers.
So if I was to just replay that back a bit, I'm hearing you say, while you know that it's going to impact your rates in the short term, you are for undergrounding the lines today, even though that's ultimately kind of playing into PG&E's hand, if you will, because they're going to increase the rate base rather than a much less expensive solution, yet not nearly as effective, according to the research that's been done on essentially insulating the lines. Because your belief is that insulating the lines today is just going to lead to the need for undergrounding in the future. So it sounds like that's what your thoughts, and ultimately that would lead to even far greater rates for you down the road.
Yeah, in essence, it's fix the problem now, or keep addressing it and maybe never fixing it later.
Yeah, Paul, curious your perspective on this.
It's a toughie because I like to have strong opinions about these things, obviously. I obviously am not an advocate for utilities, right? I think within the company, I'm generally one of the people that's most willing to get in a fist fight with. This is at the end of the day, right? Like, really, we're in partnership with the utilities on most every project like that we're going to look to build, right? So it's important to play nice. But honestly, with this is one of the problems where I do think about, and Patty Pope, who's the CEO of PG&E right now. This is one where I really sympathize with her because, she's a really smart lady, and I'm sure she's realizing, right, that, it seems like there's a bunch of linear problems, right, that should have a linear solution, but really that's not the case, right? If you look at just the scale of PG&E's territory, it's not something where I would want to be responsible for vegetation management, right? Like this was the line of thinking for the longest time was, well, we just got to take care of the trees in the right way around the lines, and this won't be a problem. Right. And that line of thinking works until it doesn't, and whatever, 70 plus people die in a fire, right? So then it becomes real serious. At the same time, right, spending $30 billion on undergrounding lines, that's more money than the utility would have ever spent on any other infrastructure project in its history, right? And that's including the construction of a nuclear power plant, right? So that's the other side of things, right? And especially, I mean, if you are a small business or a business that's right has power as a key operational item, right? If your power bills go up 20% year over year, 30% year over year, maybe they jump another 50% because of these undergrounding costs, right? At a certain point, there will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? And I think there's that real trade-off for us in the business too, right? And putting my distributed energy resources hat on again, I think what's partially frustrating to me is, yes, undergrounding and covering some of these conductors are two solutions. I think the third one that doesn't get enough play, and there are businesses out there that are essentially staking their business model on this, right? So there's businesses like Boxpower, for example, right? Where essentially the value is just, hey, it costs $3 million per mile to underground the line. If you've got, a load somewhere that's way, way distant from anywhere else, right? Why don't you just remove that line and build distributed generation there, right? And there are people out there in the industry who are fighting that good fight. There's a gentleman I'm going to shout out here. I don't have a personal relationship with him, but I've just seen him. He's got a great blog post, so I'll give him a quick shout out here. His name is Richard McCann. He's an economist in California who has done really good work, essentially just proving the case for distributed energy resources over things like undergrounding power lines, right? Just making it really clear that there are more effective or cost-effective solutions. But like I said, right, at that point, all these things I've talked about, you're already juggling 4 or 5 variables and stakeholder groups, right? And I do think the other interesting thing to note here, Patrick, is right, like over the past week and a half or so, right, this has all changed. The CPUC has suddenly said, okay, maybe we're not interested in just letting PG&E follow up with this undergrounding plan. Let's look at covered conductors, right? And I think if you look at the CPUC website itself, you can see why, right? Because it's a tenth of the cost, right? And you're still 65% safe as opposed to, I think they say 98% for the undergrounding. Yeah, I don't know. I think, again, just to me, that $30 billion price tag is really nuts. But I don't think that, I mean, this is part of the challenge, right? I don't think there is a clear solution for the system as a whole, right? I think it is what makes sense where, and I do wish that our side of the business, specifically distributed energy resources, got a lot more play in that. It just makes more sense, right? And again, I understand the instinct to want to just put in a blanket solution. I understand the instinct why you would want to do it if it comes with a $30 billion price tag, right? As a utility, if you're allowed to take profit on that.
If I can, Paul, I think the $30 billion price tag is obviously a huge obstacle to overcome. We think about some of the damage that's been a result of not doing this the right way in the first place, and lives that were lost, entire communities burnt down. I've lived through a few of the wildfires that have been the effect from this lack of maintenance and or perhaps just the vestige system that PG&E has purchased by compiling together these various companies since the late 1880s. And some of those poles that hadn't been checked, and hardware that has deteriorated like any piece of hardware will, and fallen to the ground and cause these fires. I've personally been impacted by that. I've had a warehouse of wine and equipment burned to the ground with a complete loss in 2017. To this date, I just had a meeting with my homeowner's insurance and my auto insurance. And the way she delivered it was, the good news is you still have insurance. The bad news is it's going to go up by 30%. So that's a direct correlation to 7 of the 12 top carriers in the country, insurance carriers, pulling out or restricting access to insurance program in the state of California. This isn't just a California problem. Those carriers are often, national carriers, and they're going to come to the same conclusions with a continual problem of fires and huge costs being caused by a poorly, a system that worked when it was originated. Then if not maintained, I mean, none of us are driving Model T Fords anymore. They just don't last. And the current grid is the equivalent of a Model T Ford. So I think to come back to hone the conversation specifically around paying for burying wires versus, in my opinion, adding more infrastructure to an already failed system, it's like we're asking a Model T to carry around an additional 2 tons of weight. And in some aspects, I think that analogy is spot on, because when we're adding these covers, as proposed, the base infrastructure and equipment is still a big piece of that. Those poles are not all being replaced. The extensions of those poles are not all being replaced. Some of the hardware potentially is being replaced, but not necessarily. Who's making that distinction? We're just continuing to beat up a system that wasn't designed to be what we need today. And that's why, my opinion is rooted in, well, let's quit messing around with what has been. And we know that there is a need. Energy is significant. It is what we need to continue to operate in the United States in business and home. We also need to quit putting people in peril. And undergrounding systems has proven to be the most effective way to eradicate those types of problems. And not that it shouldn't be done at any cost. And I think that this is a conversation for another time, but I think the way we reward PG&E versus the system that needs to be built are 2 very distinct things.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, Patrick. Well, and so let's kind of bring it back to how this is a very specific example in PG&E territory, but something that we're starting to see more and more of in other places across the country. We'll all remember back to the February 2021 deep freeze in Texas, and how all of the climate models did not predict that type of extreme cold snap, and the need for de-icing equipment on a lot of the different even gas-fired power plants. And so these are things that all large utilities are going to be impacted by. Time will tell. We're just a week and a half away from the next Public Utility Commission meeting here coming up on November 2nd. So hopefully we can revisit this conversation and see what their ruling was. But knowing that PG&E proposed a 26% rate hike, with a portion of this discussion in the proposed use of funds for that rate hike. What we're hearing from the CPUC is that it's going to be something more closer to 12 or 13, but that's not going to be the end of it. We'll see how this continues to evolve over time. Any closing thoughts as we wrap here, gentlemen?
Just kind of a pitch for DERs again, right, Dan? I think you nailed it. This is not just a Northern California problem, right? Like I said, I mean, I'm a Jersey boy really at heart, so I lived through Sandy. I didn't have power for about a week or so, and it does make you realize that these things are more fragile than you might expect them to be. There's a couple other recent examples, right? I mean, besides Sandy, we just had the Maui fires, right? That's likely, again, being ascribed to, for lack of a better term, utility grid hardness. So again, these are all things where, it's really cheap to not worry about it until you got to worry about it, and then it gets real expensive real quick, right? And that, again, it's part of our use case, right? As purveyors of distributed energy resources, And that's really, I mean, Patrick, totally see eye to eye with you there, right? You know, you can't be allowing for that kind of risk at a certain point, right? Especially, I mean, we've seen the costs, right, of for many of those kinds of risks. We've seen them in PG&E territory, and we've seen them in Maui. I do hope that DERs get put into the. It's an interesting one to put in the grid hardening conversation specifically, right? But I do think that they have a place there, and I hope that we see more advocacy in that realm. So that would be my closing thought.
Thanks, Paul, and I agree and appreciate. Obviously, on-site power is one of the best ways to tackle this issue. But I one thing really struck me from a recent article that was written about this topic, and I think they summarized it pretty quickly. That the covering the lines versus burying gives it about a 65% less likely to catch on fire. One of the quotes in there I really enjoyed was, so 35% will fail. Who wants to get on a plane with a 35% chance of crashing? And I love that, because that's, in essence, my points about the options is essentially it comes down to pay me now or pay me later. I'll pay that $38 increase in potential PG&E costs, but that's not factoring in also the fact that I know that my homeowner's insurance is going up 33% directly because of this. What else will I be punished with for living in California, particularly under this type of a guise? $38 a month, I'm happy to pay that.
Yeah. Well, appreciate both your time. I think this is something that we're going to continue to see. As both of you have mentioned, the grid is over 100 years old in some places. I believe the stat is that the average age of grid infrastructure across the country is on the order of 45 years old, which is quite astonishing when you really think about it being is the largest machine built by man, and yet we're still relying on it to power our businesses, and yet it's that old. So this is something that we're going to continue to see across the country. Appreciate the insights, gentlemen. Let's revisit this in a couple of weeks and see what the California Public Utility Commission rules against this. And this is a lot more to come here. So with that, we'll close. Appreciate everyone's time, and thanks for another great episode of Renewable Rides.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks. Bye now.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.